All right. We're continuing our conversation related to Soren Kierkegaard. And we've talked about the aesthetic stage of existence, and now it's time to discuss Kierkegaard's ethical stage of existence. And basically, this boils down to a kind of system of ethics that Kierkegaard's going to put in place. Excuse me. Don't inhale when you drink water, by the way. Drink the water and inhale separately. Okay, so this stage of existence is one that we move to after the aesthetic stage as faith begins to call us further forward. And this ethical stage of existence for Kierkegaard is rooted and grounded in Genesis 22. And so what I want you to do is go take a read of what's going on in Genesis 22. This is the Abraham and sort of almost sacrifice of Isaac, or the offering of Isaac. In Genesis 22, I want you to read that chapter and then come back to this video. So hit pause, go read Genesis 22, and then come back. Now that you're back and we're looking at this, Kierkegaard says the ethical stage of existence is basically our process of ethics, and it exists in two parts. There is actual ethics. Actual ethics take place here, and actual ethics are what we would consider to be customary mores. They are sort of rights and wrongs on the basis of what is customary or culturally appropriated. And then there are ideal ethics. And the ideal ethics are things that are higher than these social norms and these customary mores. Ideal ethics actually get to the principles of right and wrong, where actual ethics lives in the practical experiences here and now. The ethical realm of existence, this ethical stage of existence, is beyond the aesthetic. We're not just considering now what is most pleasing or pleasant, or what is sort of escaping some of these painful realities, but we're asking questions about right and wrong. And the first phase of that right and wrong investigation in our human existence is customary, saying please and thank you, learning to use may instead of can, right? Raising our hand in a classroom setting to say or ask a question or something like that. There are customs and practices that we consider to be good, healthy, right, etc. And on the basis of those customs, we then establish sort of ethical behaviors, okay? And then there's the ideal. And these ideal practices are not these ideal practices might include, that's the best way to put that, these ideal practices might include some of the customs and the customary mores and the sort of social norms that we were talking about in actual ethics. But they transcend it because there's some principle that underlies it, right? That sits under the surface of it that has a definition outside of just social customs or social practices and norms, right? So it works like this. Actual ethics consists of the following conditions. Number one, to have an actually ethical decision, we actually need a choice. We have to have the necessity for choosing seriously and inwardly to follow the practice and the thing that we're talking about. That is first and foremost. Any sort of ethical thing for Kierkegaard requires our ability to make this choice. Second, we have to believe that the truth labels, or the labels of good and evil, have some set of truth value, even if they're grounded in customary things, right? So good and evil are very broad terms, and they're very, they come with preloaded assumptions and understandings. But it would work like this. Customarily, it is good for you to refer to teachers by title and last name, Mr., Mrs., right, Dr., whoever. That's customary. That's proper, right? And so we believe that those things have truth value. It is a sign of respect to say Mr. Rice, or to say Mr. Lewis, to say Mrs. Pitts, or Mrs. Stone, or fill in the blank. That's customary, it's proper, it's good. On the other hand, it would be improper, it would be wrong, it would be evil, in a very broad, sort of loose sense of the term, to refer to teachers by their first names. That violates the customary expectations. But there's truth value in the claim that it's good or proper to refer to teachers in one way, and there's truth value in a claim that it's improper, bad, to refer to teachers in the other way, by first name. So, number one, we need the necessity of human choice to choose seriously and inwardly in a given situation, according to good and evil, and those labels actually having some truth value to them. Third thing we need is the choice in action has to be present. Not only do we need to choose inwardly and seriously for the right thing or the wrong thing, and the fact that there's good and evil, and those claims have value, truth value to them, but then we need the necessity of choice when it comes to our action. We have to choose seriously and inwardly first, based on the good and evil as truth value statements. And then we have to choose our action. You see, if we don't have any choice in our outward behavior, then we can't really talk about being ethical. We can just talk about being. And so here, Kierkegaard has a problem with somebody like Plato and Socrates. Knowing rightly is not automatically doing rightly, because at that point in time, doing has no truth value to it because you didn't choose it. The doing is just so automatic and mechanical, we can't even necessarily talk about it as an ethical thing. Ethics requires the choice, not only to choose the right, to understand that it is right or it is good on the basis of some truth value, some truth claim, but also then to choose the right act. Because if we don't choose the action, if it's all instinct, then there isn't really ethics. We don't talk about the instinct of an animal leading it to an unethical thing. And so what he's basically doing here in this choice of action as a necessary component to ethics is he's saying that individuals who would argue that we do an automatic from what we know, or it's self-derived somehow, and there's no choice in it, no conscious choice, both to choose the right and then to choose to do the right, then you're not really talking about ethics. You're reducing humanity to something that humanity is not. Ethics requires choice. Fourth piece to the conditions necessary for actual ethics is that our choice for our action and our choice seriously and inwardly, according to our truth claims of good and evil, has to be in accordance with the rules. And he says these rules are both universal and specific to certain communities for moral agents. Okay? So we need the necessity of choosing seriously and inwardly on the basis of truth claims of good and evil, and then the choice to act and the choice in our action. But our actions and our choices need to be in accordance with the universal rules for moral agents, and those universal rules for moral agents specifically applied to the given communities in which we live. Those universal rules are broad and they are few, and they cover what we would consider to be sort of basic do's and don'ts. A lot of what the 10 Commandments would cover, by the way. Like killing people is not a good thing. Stealing isn't okay. Lying is bad, right? These are sort of the basics that he's talking about here. So these are the conditions that we need. And in order to do actual ethics according to customary mores and social rights and wrongs, We need to be able to choose inwardly what is right and outwardly in our actions based on a belief that good and evil, right and wrong, have truth value to them, and / because that should be in accordance with universal rules for moral agents like human persons. That's actual ethics for him. Ideal ethics, he says, works like this. Ideal ethics, or what he calls meta-ethics, have a series of 5 conditions, 5 pieces that have to be part of the equation. Number 1, good and evil depend on God and not on our social norms. So you can be actually ethical, but not ideally ethical. You could be, in Kierkegaard's understanding, ideally ethical, but not necessarily actually ethical, because the ideal ethic might violate the social norm. Okay? Good and evil in ideal ethics, those truth claims of good and evil, depend not on our social labels, but on God's label and understanding. So first, good and evil aren't dependent upon human understanding, and this is where he deviates from Kant, and I like this. Good and evil depend on God's understanding of what is good and what is evil. Second, ideal ethics are essentially existential. They have to be experienced, created even in our experiences. Ideal ethics are essentially existential. This is not a theoretical exercise. They have to actually happen in our life and in the world around us and in our human experiences. And if they're not happening in our life and in our human experiences, then it's not ethics. Plain and simple. We're back to that first stage where we're living in the possible instead of living in reality. So first, good and evil depend on God. Second, essentially existential. They have to be experienced. They have to be lived out in our experiences. Third, ideal ethics are related to virtue. Because good and evil depend on God and God's definitions of good and evil, then the virtues also following that suit would be something that are these touch points for us to understanding what God's understanding of good and evil really is. It's God's understanding that it is good to tell the truth. And so honesty is a virtue. It's God's understanding that being self-controlled is appropriate, is right, is as it should be for human persons. And so self-control is a virtue. Back to temperance. It's God's understanding that wisdom or prudence is virtuous, is a good thing. Right? And so that now as a virtue orients how I understand good and evil, depending on God's definition of wisdom or prudence as a virtue. So 1, good and evil depend on God. 2, ideal ethics has to be experienced. 3, it is related to the virtues. And 4, our primary part is to be obedient to what is right and wrong in the ideal ethical system. It's not necessarily that we should determine what is right and wrong, but we should be obedient to what God has determined is right and wrong. Whether that is willful or it's sort of begrudging, Kierkegaard says either way, the task of the human person is to be obedient to what God says is right and wrong. And when we are, we can say that we are being ethical in an ideal kind of way. So first, good and evil depend on God's definitions. Because good and evil depend on God's definitions, our responsibility in ideal ethics is to be obedient as we understand the virtues and live out and through our experiences, what God has said is right. And finally, all of that process in ideal ethics begins with faith. And this is where the example of Abraham is the go-to example for Kierkegaard in ethics. In Genesis 22, God sets up Abraham with this test. And the catch is what he asks Abraham to do in actual ethics, customary mores, and social norms is not okay. Even to a point, what it seems like God is asking Abraham to do is not okay according to ideal ethics, because this wouldn't be okay according to God's definitions of what is right and wrong. On the other hand, Abraham doesn't have the full picture. And so his response is be obedient. And we see Abraham trust as he gets to the mountain and as he's, questioned by Isaac, who says, look, we've got everything we need, but where's the animal for the sacrifice? Abraham even says, God's going to provide it. Begins with faith. Here, Kierkegaard starts to get us into something that would be really considered sort of ethics from a Christian vantage point, from a Christian perspective, and from a Christian worldview. And this is helpful, and it's got a lot of instruction in it for us, but it's also really challenging. And it's challenging because it requires us to ask a series of questions and then make intentional choices about, while I may think this is the best, or this is the right, or this is the good, I have to at least be open and willing that through faith, I understand God has said this over here is the right. This is the thing to do. This is the thing that is most important. And I need to be able to reorient from my definitions and understandings to God's definitions and understandings. And in a culture which for a large part of its history, the United States, has been saturated with Christian morals and values, it is really complicated sometimes to distinguish between what has become sort of customary cultural Christianity and what is actually gospel Christian ethics. Gospel Christian ethics would involve radical kinds of generosity and selflessness, where cultural Christianity in the United States says you work for your own and you take care of your own. Well, in that regard, the customary norms of our work and our reward for our work and the radical generosity of the gospel are at odds with one another. The customary norms of working to earn and to gather are at odds with the selflessness that God expects of his people. And here we need to pay really close attention to that, because this is what Kierkegaard is getting at. Ideal ethics is the goal of the ethical stage. Sometimes we have to go through actual ethics to get there. Sometimes actual ethics and ideal ethics line up, and it's great, and it's wonderful, and it's awesome. Sometimes they're at odds with each other, and a lot of the time they're going to be at odds with each other. And we have to choose if we are going to press beyond just the customary normal, or we're going to sit tight. Because the call of Kierkegaard and his ethical model is to push beyond what is customary and into what God says is good, healthy, right, moral, ethical, etc. But we can only do that if we begin with faith and we trust that while we may not fully understand what God is doing, he's not going to lead us into something wrong. And that is a bit nerve-wracking. Kierkegaard does not advise that we go about this process sort of blindly and without thinking it through. It has to be thought through. It has to be clear. It needs to be sort of well-crafted and well thought out and understood. But humanity, Kierkegaard says, is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to ethics. God is. And we need to do our diligence in understanding what God would say is the right thing or the wrong thing, and then apply that to a given situation to do the right thing. Okay. That'll cover us for now. So this is Thursday. We will see you guys on Friday in our live meet.